nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Black Myth Podcast. Welcome to the Black Myth Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. Today's myth is the myth that Africans do not value democracy. This is something that if you Google simply just that, plenty of things will come up questioning whether democracy is still possible in Africa. You get Council of Foreign Relations and Brookings Institute. Just a very simple Google. This will come up, and it seems to be it's shaped like there's a particular character to the continent of Africa and the Africans that exist within it, that it's something that is consistently rejected by Africans, or it's something that even if people don't say it's totally rejected, it's a question of can Africa accept democracy? And if you've listened to our prior episodes on the end of history, the myth that we just covered, and hyper-imperialism, you know that there's a inherent racism in this idea of liberal democracy and Western civilization being the thing that's going to come, lead people out of the dark ages. And, liberal democracy has caused many of the problems that we see around the world, but yet there's this idea that that's what solves it. So, so I'm not going to be on this by myself. We have two guests we're going to come on to talk. Our brother Nick and Tunde from Black Alliance for Peace, the organization I'm a part of. They're both organizers and researchers who are going to come on, who know much more than I do on these topics, to discuss this myth, some of its origins, and some of, obviously just debunking this idea of it in and of itself. And we're going to talk about the Western Sahel region and some of the recent coups that have happened over there that seem to have a different nature than some of the other coups you might see across the continent. And I mean that in the sense that the coups tend to have popular support, and or you have people who are who have been able to, the masses of people have been able to capture popular support, even if the original coups themselves may have not been led in that nature, particularly in Niger. We talked a little bit about that in the last episode. So yeah, this idea of the Africans don't value democracy doesn't really have any real weight. I mean, even Afro Barometer, a site that conducts surveys and polls on Africans, it did a survey. It said 7 in 10 Africans say that, quote, democracy is preferable to any kind of government, end quote. So it's down a little bit from a few years ago, but you talk about 70% of the continent. And most people actually oppose the kind of military rule, one party rule, one person rule. We do get a little bit in this episode also into this concept of dictatorship and, kind of problematize that terminology. But there's really no fact that, Africans are opposed to democracy in the general sense. But as we talk about in the episode, it's a bit more complicated as far as how it's presented to them, and whether, even democracy over here is supposedly what they tell us it is, right? So anyway, gonna get into that with Nick and Tunde. Do not have any we've been recording every week, so no updates on Patreons or anything like that, but I do appreciate everybody who signed up. Please continue to sign up for our Patreon. It's very helpful. Other than that, we'll be back with another episode with the same two brothers we're talking to, but with a different topic. I'm talking about the Congo, because people love to say, what about the Congo and all that, so we're going to talk about that. So we're just in an international kind of vibe right now, so we're just going to ride that out. But thank you everybody for coming through. Enjoy the episode. All right, so we're here with two of my BAP comrades, Black Alliance for Peace. I think this is the first time I've had only BAP guest on since I've been in BAP, at least. Maybe I think one time we had Erica way back. So yeah, I'm glad to have y'all both here. I know you all both have done y'all have formed a kind of tag team on other podcasts talking about these subject matters. I was just listening to the one on Rev Left before I got here. So gonna try to not just totally duplicate that interview, but I thought that had some good parts, so I'm gonna link that in the chat or link that in the show notes. But if y'all want to introduce yourselves real quick for those who are not aware, and then we can just get right into it.
Nick, Richard-Thompson, BAT Midwest organizer.
Yeah, and I'm Tunde Osazua with BAP Atlanta and BAP Africa team too. So yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah,
Definitely.
thank you. So, like we were talking about before I pressed record, actually, the first originally I think I was going to think of this episode more of like which we will do, right? What about Africa, or what about Congo? People like to say that in response to Palestine, but that'll be a different recording. But after talking with Nick about particularly what's happening in the Western Sahel, that's been happening here recently in the last few years, and can't remember our full conversation, but I know we were talking about how there's this tendency to say that Africans in the continent particularly do not value democracy. And I looked it up to see who all says this, the Council of Foreign Relations. And if you just Google this particular myth, you will find several articles that in some way, shape, or form do suggest that either Africans don't value democracy, or there is a struggle to build democracy, or there's an article we're going to link from the Council of Foreign Relations where they suggest that the West needs to build strong democratic institutions throughout Africa. So there's been suggestions by, like I said, by various political entities that Africans do not value it, or that it's on the decline. But just to clarify, like, what is meant by this claim, as a kind of part one of this question, and then part two of it is how is liberal democracy received throughout Africa?
Yeah, I'll start off. I mean, that claim and the similar arguments to me seem to be like pushing the idea that Africans, like Africa, the continent, right, needs these Western forces to come in and help and civilize like Africans, right? And I think that kind of goes along with that idea of the white man's burden, right? That Africans can't govern themselves without the West. When I think really the West is the problem, right? If we understand the African continent as being plagued by Western domination, Western imperialism and neocolonialism, then it's like, how can you even claim that democracy could truly exist under those systems of domination? Like, how and put the blame on Africans when truly it's the West that is the driver of these of the challenges that the African states face in terms of implementing democracy. And really, for me, like, democracy is a question of informed consent, right? So like, what are the benefits and the risks and the alternatives associated with a decision? Without that informed consent, without the people having that understanding of all the risks, benefits, and alternatives that are needed to make the decision, right? And then they might make choices that aren't in their best interest, and actually serve the ruling class. So like, people talk about informed consent in the context of like medical procedures, right? Like when a doctor is having to kind of explain their the different procedures that they're recommending, and highlighting what would be the risks associated with a certain procedure or medicine. And so yeah, I think that doctor explaining the all the aspects of the decision is could be compared to like political education processes, right? So I think for democracy to really be effective, right, it takes political education. It takes like a revolutionary consciousness on the part of the people, right, for them to understand the broader context that they're living in, right, and for them to be committed to a revolutionary program. So yeah, I think those are important things to think about when we're thinking about this question of democracy under or in situations of Western imperial and neocolonial domination. But yeah, I think if the masses had have a collective consciousness around imperialism and neocolonialism, then imperialists wouldn't be able to manipulate different processes. For example, right, like um, when Sudan had Sudan has been engaged in various struggles and under attack by imperialism for decades, right? And so there was a push in that the late 2000s, like I guess 2011 or so I guess the early 2010s for like a referendum to split up Sudan so that it was easier for the West to access the resources available in South Sudan. They pushed for a referendum, right? And a referendum is a very democratic process, right? Like it's kind of like a form of direct democracy, right? But because there wasn't that mass political education, like that process really ended up serving the US and other Western powers. So I think that's just an example of like how that plays out. But yeah, I would just say that we have to be talking about all those systems. We have to be talking about class struggle and how classes decide, right? Like the masses have to have agency in these processes, and we just have to also understand that self-determination is a collective process. So yeah, that's my first point, right? Like it's through political education, through informed consent, that democracy can actually take hold. And I would argue that even here in the US, we don't have real democracy, right? There's all these ways that the people aren't informed on all these decisions that they're supposed to be able to make. And so I think that's an important point to make. And so just my next quick point is that uh, I guess, here in the US, on the African continent, right? Like all these forms of democracy that we're told are the gold standard, right? Like they tend to serve the interests of the elite. Um, and multi-party systems, right? Which is what we have, right? Like there's the Democrats, the Republicans, and all the other third parties or whatever. They create like this artificial like polarization, right? Like there's like these superficial allegiances to parties and positions, right? Like here in the US, things like abortion or other hot button issues or what make a huge difference for voters, right? And I think that is forced onto African countries, like that multi-party system, um, and it kind of forecloses like the possibility of like debate and real true discussion on the merits of different issues and sides to issues, and makes it so that people are voting alongside their party affiliation versus their the true I guess issues at hand. And so I think the multi-party system is it makes things less democratic, and that's kind of what's been forced on Africans. I would say that even when we talk about this whole idea of you know uh, uh, liberal democracy or multi-party system is something that is foreign to the continent, and it's something that we see as yeah, I think it's alien to the processes that should exist in on the African continent. So yeah, and I would say that it also prevents organization on various levels, right? Like so here in the US, we're organized according to like our geographic districts, and we're represented in those ways. But other societies that maybe aren't using that multi-party system, like let's say Cuba, right? They have women's organizations and youth organizations. Those sectors are organized, and they have a say in how their decisions get made. And I think that organization allows them to pursue their interests as a sector of society, right? And here in the U.S., we're not organized in that way, and many African states don't have that level of organization. And so I would finally say that, democracy is really a question of how organized the society is. And, multi-party systems don't allow for that type of organization. But I'll stop there. I've kind of gone on for a little bit.
No, I appreciate all your comments. I want to echo them. And then I'll just add briefly that uh, the continent and the countries in the continent instability benefits, I would argue, Western countries. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, Tunde hit on something. Let's question the democracy that we have. Mind you, the material conditions for all of these countries are different, but here, the democracy even we have should be questioned because there's numerous studies that have been shown that have been done. One by Princeton I want to raise up, and I'll send it to you. You can show it in the show notes. It was analyzed for 20 years of data, and they were looking at public support of ideas and policies. Then it compared it to Congress passing laws representing those ideas and policies. And what it showed in the kind of the analysis at the end was economic elites, business interests, and those who could afford to lobby, in fact, did meet the criteria for having a democracy. So those who do not have that did not have a democracy by the measurements and the elements that they chose to measure that, right? I think it's important to question first the legitimacy of Western liberal democracy. That's the first thing, because I think we smuggle in the idea that that is the elite, the pivotal and the pinnacle, rather, of political systems, and that if African countries are not utilizing those, that is the pretext to, I think, occupy, invade, indirect rule, and subvert some of these different countries' progresses, right? I don't think a coup is inherently bad. I would argue that if you have the military power and then the popular support to maintain it, that's the most democratic, I think, aspiration you could see, right? In particular, the Sahelian coups have mass popular support on the ground. So, right, like these theoretical ideas of democracy, these institutions, legal positivism, a federated country with representation, right? Like, if you don't meet this criteria, I think it's been set in a way that if you don't meet the criteria of that, it's just used to legitimize different interferences, right? And when we hear about in BAP, when we talk about like the right to protect and different forms of humanitarian crises and interventions, these are all pretexts. That's what it comes down to. So I think democracy is a sham. And, I personally subscribe to participatory democracy, direct democracy, and the definition that Gaddafi put forward. He said it's an authority of the people. If the people don't have an authority, you don't have a democracy. He criticized very much so parliamentary and the United States democracy, suggesting that when you have results of a victory of a candidate like 51%, 49, he was like, you have a dictatorship still, right? You have a large mass of people who don't feel represented. And in actual fact, that's a dictatorship of another kind, right? And so, in the reality is the political system prevailing in the world today are dictatorial systems, right? Those are the ones that are not exercising the will of the people. It's not creating institutions that are shaping and engaging people to be active participants in the direction and the decision making in their daily lives. They keep out the many of the African populations in these professionalized and roles in institutions, but also just economically and politically, right? The instability that comes about, what's never questioned or talked about in a lot of these articles, as you mentioned, the foreign council relations. If they do mention it, it's very little. They don't talk about the primary contradiction of colonialism and indirect rule. And we'll talk more about this later, but, not having control over your financial system, not having real control over the day-to-day operations of your governing structures and your ultimately your police systems, that is not democratic. So what Africans are rejecting actually is not democracy. What they're rejecting is colonialism, and they use that as a veneer. And I say the Western states use that as a veneer to undermine and directly or indirectly interfere with, I think, African development.
Thanks for that. This isn't on our question sheet, but I did want to ask it or trouble this word a little bit. You brought up the word dictatorship, and that's a word that gets thrown around a lot by the West, particularly to define, Africans, and there definitely are like negative dictators in the African continent. We need not, and corruption and all that, but corruption is something that seems sometimes to be almost indigenous to being African or and a leader, the way that is explained in kind of the modern context. And you always see a lot of like anti-corruption campaigns, particularly across the continent. Um, and so the word dictating becomes entirely negative. But if somebody has the ability to make a choice, and then other people have to go do said choice, like whatever that choice is, that's some form of dictating, no matter what. So even when we think about the name or the term dictatorship or dictating, I'm just curious what some of y'all thoughts are as far as just the idea of that. And again, some people might hear this and think we're trying to promote some kind of autocratic, top down, a repressive thing. But it's just to say again, these terms get thrown, like we're talking about education, these terms get thrown, particularly at the African continent and also, other colonized nations as well. But we never really like sit with what does dictatorship even mean? So like, I guess a base question is like, is a dictatorship inherently a negative thing, or does it depend on the character of it? Like, how should we understand this term? And then also how it is used against us.
Yeah, so I'll answer first. So the term, I see it as neutral depending on the context, and I think always trying to figure out context. Very similar to the word propaganda. Some of these words become very charged for political reasons, of course, to utilize these words and these phrases to create different scare tactics, fear, and then to delegitimize different political projects, right? In the same way that, like, if you call someone a communist or a socialist United States, regardless of their politics, they can be a progressive, right? Regardless of their politics, like that is a type of
They could be
rhetoric.
they could be a right winger, and it's okay, and get caught.
Yeah, like it's just a word that it's
Yeah.
lost all meaning. So I
Yeah.
really feel like authoritarian, dictatorial loses a lot of meaning, though there are instances that are, like, as you mentioned, repressive and hierarchical in a way that is not conducive to building a society that's participatory. So for me, I think it's important to form a politic and to not pretend to know the will of the people, but have institutions and the different, I think, allowances for people to form their own will. And liberal democracies don't inherently have that. So for me, again, going back to Gaddafi using his language, and even Lenin, calling a dictatorship of the proletariat, he was very honest in that, right? There are instances where I would say, yeah, I would support control, community control of the police. If that's a dictatorship, that's a dictatorship. I would also support the state being controlled by those who run the country, or who rather the labor runs the country, and that's working people. So I think it's a neutral term. We already have a dictatorship. I think in the United States, oftentimes dictatorship exists. We have a dictatorship of capital, like I mentioned earlier. Working people don't have a democracy done by the qualitative and quantitative studies by Princeton, but wealthy people do. So I would just ask people to sit with that, look at the different studies, really ask yourself, is it a quality of democracy that elected officials at the national level can have different amount of investments in companies that they are legislating for, or different amount of investments just in things that pertain to like their policy making? Does that sound like that there might be a conflict of interest there, right? Like there are many instances where I think just if we question where we're at, the word becomes neutral. There are instances of it being negative and instances of it just being a fact. And so, yeah, I would leave it there. I think there are instances, and we'd be remiss if we didn't like say that there are dictatorial like regimes on the continent right now that are committing atrocities. That being said, and we'll get into it later, I would still point at colonialism, not a lack of democratic institutions, as to why some of these atrocities are happening. And I would argue that it's capitalism and the drive for constant profit and protecting multinational corporations is why the United States picks and chooses where it intervenes. Mind you, this is not a call for the United States to intervene anywhere, but I think it illustration underscores the fact that the United States doesn't go everywhere to fight for human rights, right? It goes places where its investments or its geopolitical strategies are under threat, and then they use the pretext of these things. Because right now we're seeing calamity in Gaza. They're not doing anything about that. In fact, they're doing everything in their power to support it, right? You could look at the Congo or Sudan, and like these are instances where the United States has like historically perpetuated what's going on in the Congo in the early 90s and the genocide there. So just be wary of the inconsistency of the United States and other Western countries claiming humanitarian concerns or concerns for democracy. One, they don't have them, but two, they don't intervene in all these other places where it's not at. They only intervene when their interests are at stake, and that is the consistency. So that's what I would say to your
Yeah.
question.
No, definitely. That covers basically all of it. I would just add that I think the character of the state also, speaks to how we understand this idea of dictatorship, right? Like if we're talking about a capitalist state, right, it's organized to maintain the capitalist system. And so that means there's like a dictatorship of the capitalists um over the rest of, the state, the rest of the society, right? And so, they use force or the threat of violent force and all their, I guess, capitalist institutions, right? That are able to protect, their dictatorship, their rule, right? And so the function of the capitalist state is to protect itself and, the capitalist class. And so that means that it's kind of managing, all the issues, all the contradictions, between or within, the capitalist class, and between the capitalist class and the rest of the society. And so like if we're talking about a different type of state, like a socialist state, right? Like then, there's, a different type of dictatorship, right? And that means that, the masses of people, the broad mass of people in the state are collectively working to decide how are they going to manage the society, right? Like how much are they going to produce? What are they going to produce? What are the conditions that they're working under, the conditions that they're working, how are they going to meet their needs and the needs of the society? So I think, it's just it kind of just depends on, what kind of state we're talking about as well. Um and yeah, I bet everything next to that too.
So yeah, thanks for that. I think again, it's just important to flesh that out, just because people hear those terms, and people don't even have to agree with what we're saying or what y'all said, but it's just that we need to at least be critical of those terms. So some people will say, states are inherently bad, or some people will say that, that any kind of vertical structure is oppressive, and whether we agree or not, I'm just saying, like, there needs to at least be some interrogation, and there's just assumptions that are made about Africa and about African leaders and any kind of struggle in Africa that just doesn't even allow for a conversation, because it just, like y'all said, paints a binary that the West has democracy and freedom and liberty and all this shit figured out, and then elsewhere is all this repressive, everybody's dictated to, and nobody has any say in anything or any day-to-day life. And it's just that's much more complicated, as y'all both pointed out. And I guess, like, as a last question, just wrap up on this liberal democracy question. So, Nick, you alluded to it. So if we are saying that, Africa is under, a neo-colonial, is in a neo-colonial phase, is in neo-colonial arrangements all across the continent, then what purpose does liberal democracy necessarily serve in that case, if they're already stuck under a situation in which they do not control the day-to-day things that happen in their lives?
For sure. So ultimately, in my estimation, I would say that liberal democracy, Western liberal democracy being installed and championed, is an effort to maintain the larger global capitalist hegemonic system, and to make safe investment for whether it's the World Bank, IMF, or other countries engaging with these different African states. Because oftentimes, right, the other path that's generally taken is a socialist one, or even if it's not explicitly socialist, they will take some of the main resources and different industries over state rule. That makes it very hard to exploit resources, right? So for me, I think one of the purposes, and there's many, it's multifolded, of Western liberal democracy. Some of it's political, it's ideological, it's hegemonic. There's numerous, but it's to make the country safe for investment for their multinational corporations, and to create stability to a degree. I think instability, as I mentioned earlier, is a characteristic that they thrive on. When I say they, the Western countries thrive on. But also when we're looking at how there's resource exploitation, and they prioritize funneling resources out of Africa to enrich the coffers of the variety of different, multinational corporations, right? The purpose of AFRICOM has been stated outwardly that it is to control the free-flowing resources out of Africa. Their other purpose is to curb extremism and terrorism, though since its inception, terrorism has increased, right? Due to the fact that there were studies done and they asked folks who had joined some of these groups, like, why'd you join? Oh, it was because a family member of mine was murdered, or our livelihood was destroyed because some of the tactics and technology and methods of AFRICOM and the presence of these Western, countries destroyed the arable land, and like we live off the land, and they destroyed that, so they destroyed our farming. And when you can, contend that with the ecological catastrophes that take place, like a lot of these countries and a lot of these people live off of the land, so you're destroying their livelihood. Very similarly, what I always try to bring it back to, so it's not like too far away, right? Like if you live here in the United States, which I think is an internal colony, separate conversation, but I think it's an internal colony. I had brothers who joined gangs for economic reasons, right? They had bad schooling, didn't have economic opportunities, and due to that, it was a recipe for disaster. They joined different gangs to join informal economies to find some way to, one, find community. I think they're always searching for, and this is not just like anecdotal story. This is like, you hear this from a lot of folks organized with former street organizations that are now trying to turn revolutionary. And I hear the same thing. They're like, yeah, we did what we know now through our consciousness. We understand the conditions, our environment produce a particular mentality that led us to be, whether to engage in violence or the informal economies out of survival. So in the same way, these extremist groups prey upon that, and they utilize the presence of these Western countries that have claimed to create stability, but haven't created it, which is why a lot of these Sahaelian countries are booting out France and, the United States, military forces, and going to the Wagner group with Russia. Separate conversation, we'll get there though. So because the stability hasn't been brought, the economic, instability is still there. There are droughts that they deal with. There are regional conflicts, right? There are legitimate grievances for some of the different territorial conflicts. But again, these are all as a consequence to colonialism because of illegitimate drawn borders, right? The starvation of these countries. So when you think about how these countries they're called developing countries, which is kind of a euphemism, or they're called underdeveloped, which is a misnomer. They're being overexploited, right? And the reality is development has stalled, not as a happenstance, but because of the intervening of Western corporations and Western countries, trying to continue their capitalist, economies. So that is what ends up creating the instability economically, politically, militarily. And then you have the variety of different instances of, I think, just, no, we don't trust these Western institutions, and they have legitimate reason not to, right? African countries don't have their own, or a lot of the African countries don't use their own currency, right? That's what Gaddafi was coming for. That's what Ibrahim Traore is trying to bring in, an independent currency, right? So for me, when we're talking about democracy, if the Western countries were interested in democracy, I think there'd have to be a serious engagement with the reality that the CFA franc throughout the Francophone region of Africa, which is where all the Sahelian countries, are leading so-called, these military juntas. They're doing that because there's been histories and lasting legacies of just instability and drought politically and economically. And when you combine some of the facts of the CFA franc and the governance of their political systems as well, of course, these different countries would want to reject, French Western kind of rule. So to kind of summarize, you asked the questions about, neocolonialism. I think it's imperative to never lose sight of that in our calculus, because a lot of times when African countries are talked about, there isn't really a deep engagement on why these countries have been where they're at. It's more of a pointing at them and suggesting that perhaps they don't appreciate democracy, or the African personality can adopt it, when actually I don't think democracy has been tried out in a genuine, true form by my definition. And two, the democracy that they're bringing isn't to bring stability. It isn't to bring institutions that are there to direct the will of the people. It isn't to create participatory processes. It's to create safe investment and to continue the hegemonic project of the Western liberal capitalist project. And it makes it very difficult for investment, for the larger global capitalist economy, if there are certain segments of resources and minerals at those stages of production that they don't have clear access to. So that's what we end up with.
All right. So kind of closing out on or moving on, I guess, to you brought and you already mentioned it, Nick, but I'm kind of gonna come to Tunde, but on the question of coups, because this is another thing that is used to dem that is used to argue, that Africans have no appetite for democracy is because there are coups all throughout Africa, and there's been a large number of them since countries at least started getting their flag independence. This is something. This was in a this was when a BAP bulletin. We were quoting the AAPRP 106 coups d'etats in Africa since 1950. 103 have been of a reactionary nature, with only exceptions being Nasir in Egypt and Gaddafi in Libya and Sankara in Burkina Faso. And then there's obviously the recent coups that we're going to get to, but I'm using that number to say they're saying out of most, there's been 106, 103 have been reactionary. The other three haven't been. If people have actually studied those histories, then some people will use that as kind of an argument that you know there's not much of an appetite for democracy as people maybe at least popularly understand it, even though we've already kind of broken that down. But there still are coups that do happen. So, like, what are the causes of some of these coups? Obviously, every situation has its own internal contradictions. So we're not saying that there's one like easy way to explain them. Every situation is different. But what are some of the larger forces that do drive coups in ways that we'll see them on TV? And it's just, and even some of these movies we watch, like a Hotel Rwanda, or something about some movies that talk about African dictators, like we'll just see one militia taking out another, and there's no context. So again, like, what are some of the causes, and how should we understand those forces that drive them?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we were talked about already, right? Like the African continent has been, facing a crisis of imperialism, of colonialism or neocolonialism, right? That can be traced back hundreds of like 600 years, back to, the inception of the transatlantic slave trade, and the subsequent colonial period, and today's neocolonial period, right? And so we know that those broader, like that broader history kind of helps explain why a lot of these coups have taken place, right? But not all the coups are staged for the same reasons, right? Like you know like you said, to like the most of the reactionary coups have been orchestrated by the West, by the US, the French, the Portuguese, and other European powers to overthrow revolutionary governments on the continent, right? They kind of like they tried to hide the hand of the West, so the hand of the imperialists and their puppets, but really that was the driving force behind many of the reactionary coups. But then we know around the world, right, throughout history, right, like especially in the 20th and 21st centuries, right? Pro people and anti-colonial movements have conducted coups of their own, overthrowing, oppressive and brutal regimes, and securing gains, like material gains for the masses who, before the coup had like the colonizers' boots on their necks. And so I think, that is important to name. And, like you said, there are over 100 coups that took place since 1950. But just to name a few, right? One of the first and most brutal coups was the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba, who was the democratically elected president of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He was detained, he was murdered, and dissolved in a barrel of acid, right? And they overthrew him with backing from the U.S., backing from Belgium and France, and many colonial forces, right? And so they're essentially just working to overthrow that government that was coming out of like a colonial a period of domination, right? And the same can be said of like the CIA coup of Kwame Nkrumah in 1966, right? He was visiting China at the time, uh, kind of talking about a plan to end the U.S. war on Vietnam while he was there, and they went in and couped him, and so it's the same the same idea with that, and then also the coup of Amilcar Cabral in 1973, right? The Portuguese assassinated him before uh, the party that he was a part of, the party he was a leader in, won independence, the PAIGC, or the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, right? And so, the PAIGC came to power a few months later, but then was also overthrown in 1980 by a French orchestrated coup, right? So, this is just a list of, really
I
kind of
would add, even we noticed Sankara was Thomas Sankara, his coup was one of the progressive coups, but then he was also overthrown 4 years later too, right?
exactly,
By his
exactly.
so-called best friend. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that was
Right.
in 1987.
Yep. Yeah.
And yeah, no, that's a great point. And so those are all that's just a list of like Western inspired coups, right? Like coups that were reactionary. But then there are plenty of examples across the world, but I guess only three in Africa's history that kind of defied or like went against that trend of reaction, and were conducted in the interests of the masses of people in these countries, right? And so a lot of those military uprisings, right, were Pan-African in nature and revolutionary, right? There's the example I think you already mentioned them, but like Gamal Abdel Nasser in um, 1952 executed a coup, or the military of that time executed a coup in Egypt, and Nasser became president in 1956, and that was the first modern African state to have revolutionary land reforms. Obviously, there are critiques of all these governments, but that's seen as like a coup d'état that was positive and was conducted under the proper conditions, I guess, for to be revolutionary in nature. There's also the one that saw Gaddafi take power in Libya, right? From the British-backed monarchy, and I guess led by King Idris the First. And they nationalized oil reserves and used that revenue to fund the redistributive programs for the people. And Libya, shoot, I know that there's all sorts of opinions, but that is also seen as like a revolutionary coup. And then Sankara, like you mentioned, Two Black, right? He overthrew his, I guess the military at that time overthrew the government, and they were able to implement widespread social programs across their country for the Burkinabe people. Things like educational programs that increase the literacy rate from like something like 17% to 73%. They appointed women to really high positions in his administration, which was really unusual at the time, and very progressive. And they outlawed forced marriages and built roads and infrastructure to connect different parts of Burkina Faso, and really modernize the country. So I would kind of divide the coups into those two camps, right? The revolutionary versus the reactionary, and kind of see it that way. But obviously, because of neocolonialism, imperialism, there's all sorts of economic insecurity. There's a lack of democratic institutions. There's real low development, and just a lot of instability, right? Like there's all sorts of violence and civilian unrest that allows for coups to proliferate across the continent. Um, and I mean, people are living in really dire conditions, right? Like these are countries in turmoil. Like a lot of African countries are dealing with really tough situations, and so I think that has to be taken into account when we think about what is causing these coups. Um, but like we said, every situation has its own contradictions. But I would speak to those larger forces just to start out.
Yeah, and I'll be brief, and that's why I like doing these things with Tunde, because you always remind me of things that I just forgot. So another thing I want to angle for this, the Cold War never really ended. It's been a continuation. I argue that a lot of these coups are taking place, and when they're supported or not supported, or even United States or Western countries capitalizing off some of these coups is to maintain and ensure that you don't have an Nkrumah or a Patrice Lumumba or Thomas Sankara take power. Nkrumah was a force on the continent, regardless of what people feel about some of his politics. He was very successful in terms of policy, and he was beloved. And the reality is, he trained and armed people in the ANC. He supported the African liberation fighters and financed a lot of them. And after his, he didn't have a coup. He had more different stages of power. But after that, 35 countries on the continent gained independence, supported by Ghana in a variety of different ways, from Mozambique and to Patrice Lumumba, all these other people. So I think it's important to mention that. I don't think it's lost upon the United States that if Nkrumah writing about the importance of unity now, Africa unite, he wrote about that. And he was of the kind of, there was two fragments of building during his time, those who wanted to unite over a period of time, like decades, and he wants to unite now in terms of building a legitimate pan-African type of federated state. And what we're kind of seeing with the AES, the Sahelian states, I think they did right by doing that immediately to protect each other, both militarily, to preserve what their advancements they've made, but also to integrate their economies and their political systems. If we're going to get out of this situation, it's going to require unity. And I think when some of these leaders who have the charismatic personality, who have the politics, who are bringing in anti-imperialist and anti-colonialism explicitly, they're incredibly dangerous to the global political project. Again, I don't think it should be lost upon us. At the same time of Nkrumah's revolution, revolutionary movement, rather, he's overthrown when he's going to China to talk about ending the Vietnam War, right? Right now, who are the largest opponents and aggressors in Western media? China and Russia still today, right? Now, history doesn't rhyme, but it repeats, or it doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, right? So I think, a continuation of the Cold War also plays a role, because I'll give you an example. Most recently, Niger holds one of the largest drone bases that operates out of Africa. They have moved to start working with Russia. The United States tried to unilaterally decide that that wasn't allowed. So Nigeria said, well, then you have to move out your drone base. We're not. So again, these countries are working towards self-determination. They're working towards independence economically and politically, and they're seeking different partners to achieve that. And the Western countries do not like that. And there's an emerging just new multipolar world that I think African states, and we should worry about our interests, African states are at times used as chess pieces in a way, the best way I could describe it, in this Cold War, because I don't think, any of these other states care genuinely about Africa, but there are better actors than others, right? I would say China and Russia, developmentally and militarily, have been better actors on the continent so far than, say, France, United States, Germany, Canada, the entire Nordic region. Don't get started in those places, right? So that's what I also want to add to that, to the conversation of why these things are occurring. There's geopolitical reasons, there's economic reasons, and that's always important.
Yeah, and I think I was just interviewing someone the other day, and they said, we don't get to pick the conditions that we struggle under, right? So you are forced to deal with the world as it is, and you can have your goals and your ideology and your intentions in mind, but you still got to struggle through the world as is. So some coups are, people trying to struggle through all coups are people trying to struggle through the world as it is, whether they do it successfully or not, right? But when we get to the questions of China and Russia, which I sometimes get tired of those conversations because I just don't feel like people are being honest. But I'm just saying, I think people got to deal with the situation as it is. So coming to that, on y'all mentioned the Western Sahel. So there's, since 2008, again, this is from Rafiki Morris, I think, and this is also in a BAP document as well. But since 2008, 15 U.S. trained officers have had a hand in 12 West African coups. So there's also some of these coups I think we didn't mention, but it's important to note that a lot of these are a lot of these coups are people who are militarily trained by the West in some way, shape, or form. They were armed by the West. They were taught by the West. That doesn't inherently mean that they're bad, but it does require some investigation, considering that a lot of coups we discuss, and even ones we haven't named, are coming from places where they were trained by outside entities. These are not places that built their own guns and have their own manufacturing and things of that nature. Like, this is usually coming from somewhere else. So that there's something to look at, but sometimes that can go wrong. Like, sometimes an empire overexpands, trains up too many people, and things go wrong. We see that in Africa. We see that even in the Middle East. You try to train people up, and sometimes they use that training against you. So it just depends. So recently, there's been 3 coups in the Western Sahel region of Africa, in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. And in Mali and Burkina Faso, and each one has their own. I think sometimes they all get blocked together because they work together, but they do have their own dynamics. So could you describe, coming back to Tunde here, the dynamics of each coup briefly, if you could, and then how they're also intertwined?
Yeah. So, like you said, all 3 in the Western Sahel, which is one of the most exploited and one of the poorest regions on the African continent. Um, and so, like you said, a coup is understandable for these folks because, they kind of have no choice. Like, they've experienced decades of neocolonialism, um, which, to them manifests in like the control of their economy and resources and the expenditures of their countries going to the West or to militarism. And so, I think that context is important. Um, that that the neocolonialism, as we've been talking about, is the broader context. But we could also point to the role of the U.S. and NATO war on Libya, which flooded the Sahel with weapons to arm paramilitary groups, or what folks call terrorist groups, to further the neocolonial destabilization of the Sahel, right? That destabilization, opened up or made it easier for some of these coups to take place. And those weapons that went to those groups were supplied by the U.S. and France, as you mentioned too, Black. So I think we could talk about the coup in Mali, right, as the first one that kind of um, was lashing on to kind of an anti-imperialist consciousness and an anti-French sentiment. I know we'll get into that more later, but that allowed them to position themselves in opposition to the West, right? So it was Assimi Goïta who came to power in that Malian coup, right? And this came after a series of things, right? Like, Mali had a number of coups over the past couple of decades, over the past like 10 15 years, right? We could go back to 2013 when France intervened in Mali, right, to control the forces that France had unleashed, right, through the war in Libya, because France was really involved, the UK, the US, a lot of NATO forces, right? So the Libya invasion kind of unleashed all these paramilitary or terrorist forces that captured half of Mali's territory. Um, and so, in 2015, those groups also started to attack Burkina Faso, which we'll get to in a little bit. But France intervened, right, and sent soldiers of the armies of these different countries to die against the paramilitary groups that France had backed in Libya. And so that created a lot of, discontent or animosity amongst the soldiers, like these Burkinabe and Malian and Nigerian soldiers that went to fight the paramilitary groups. And it was patriotic sections of those soldiers that rebelled against their own governments and overthrew them, right? And so that's just like a general that's general context. But the governments of Mali and Niger have actually said, in places like the UN and elsewhere, that France is helping these paramilitaries or these terrorist groups, and help training them, offering them support in various ways. And I would go so far as to say that France and the US and other Western powers are the true terrorists. And I think Traore, who I'll talk about in a second, has of Burkina Faso, has said that terrorism is a product of neocolonialism. So anyway, so that Malian coup is the first one, right? And so that happened in 2020, right? There was a president, but the previous president who was overthrown, his name was Ibrahim Keita, and he was widely viewed as corrupt, too close to France, and really unable to address the security situation that I was speaking of. And so, there was also things like, really high unemployment. It was like 50%. And, he was putting down protests because, a lot of civilians were, engaging in massive uprisings against, these forces I'm speaking to, the unemployment, the French domination, and other things. And so, there was a second coup in January 2021 that dissolved the government and replaced it with a government led by Assimi Goita, who was trained by the U.S. To your point, too, Black, right? And so there was some confusion around, what is his stance going to be, right? Like, how is he going to orient himself vis-a-vis, the U.S., France, and the West more generally. But he went along with the masses, right? The masses who were in the streets, who had this anti-imperialist consciousness. And so, I think it's really impressive the way that Mali, was able to assert itself. And, actually in December of 2021, they had a process, like a national consultative process to restructure and recreate kind of the Malian state. And so that came with like 500 reform recommendations, things around, ecological and disability rights, economic things, trade union relations. And, those are really popular reforms in Mali and the region at large. And so, eventually people understood that, Mali was not going along with, Western forces essentially. So, off the heels of Mali, right? Like there's, all this uh, um, excitement around, that development in nearby Mali and Burkina Faso, right? And they also have, on the ground movements, people like mass uprisings that are anti-imperialist, right? And so the president who was couped in Burkina Faso, his name was like Kabore, right? And he was basically he was in the Thomas Sankara government. He was working for the Blaise Compaoré government, right? The one who was a traitor and worked to overthrow and murder Sankara, right? And so he actually oversaw the prosecution of Compaoré, right, for the murder of Sankara, um, and so his successor, the one who kind of overthrew him, his name was Damiba, was actually most like he's easily, I guess you can most easily see him as reactionary, right? Like his predecessor oversaw the trial of Compaoré, but Damiba was was willing to pardon Compaoré as one of his first acts as he came into power. So we saw that he wasn't going to take the anti-imperialist position of the Burkinabe masses. So Traoré, also chose well, Traoré was able to I guess come to power in a coup of Damiba. And right, the broader context is like the masses are anti-imperialist, they're anti-French, and they want change, right? Like they want to see distance, like distance between their state and the French state. And they're not going to get that with Damiba, right? It's not just that trial piece and the pardoning that showed that, but just other statements he made. And so Traore, who is currently the head of state in Burkina Faso, right? He came to power, and he's been going along with the masses. He's been listening to their demands. Um, for example, he chose a prime minister that was very familiar to the people. That's someone who was active in the Sankara government, who was helping to create lots of like the committees for the defense of the revolution in Burkina Faso, and really about building uh, the power and the self-determination of the masses. And Traore was also, listening to the people when they're saying, let's kick the French military out of Burkina Faso, right? And he's been involved in efforts to delink the Burkinabe media from the West. And so I think that's important to name. And then we could also move to Niger, which is the most recent coup, right? And I think that coup sparked a lot of interest from the U.S. and obviously France, right? France has been really impacted by all of these because of the high the prevalence of the anti-French sentiment. And so actually more recently, right, like um uh uh the Nigerian military, right? They were, they took power, right, and they imprisoned the Nigerian, I guess, uh, uh, president, right, the former president, and basically that process, um, which put in place, Chiani is the head of state, right, like the military leader Chiani. That was a process that was also kind of on the heels of the uprisings in Burkina Faso and Mali. And I would say that, these countries are, pretty similar. Like the borders are really porous. Like there's a lot of intermixing, like families that, are split like along the border because of, colonialism and how they're artificially drawn, right, through processes like um, the I guess the Berlin Conference in the late 1800s, where different colonial powers came together and kind of decided which parts of the continent they would dominate. And so because of that, the conditions are pretty similar across the different countries. Obviously, there's different timing in terms of when the coups took place, and different sentiments. Like I would say in Burkina Faso, there's a strong um, element of just mass consciousness raising, political education that led to a lot of the uprisings. And I think Niger and Mali have followed suit in terms of trying to develop some of that.
So, real sorry to hop in real quick. And maybe Nick could speak to this. Was so Niger, what specific interest did Niger serve for the United States? Like in regards to the military side of things. And then could you also speak to the something Tunde spoke about as far as what was you already spoke to some of it, but this kind of, I guess, anti-French sentiment. Like what was
Absolutely.
the factors that led to it?
Yeah, I can be brief on that. So, with Niger and the anti-French sentiments, Niger is a important strategic area of control due to the fact that it has the largest drone base, and 200 to 300 million dollars has already initially been put into it, and then since its inception, 20 to 30 million is put into it to do upkeep. So it's really important for the continent at large, for the United States to have military ties with Niger. I think that's why initially they actually didn't say much about the coup, if people look back at that, because I think they wanted to maintain some type of relationship there for their own political interests. And even with a lot of these coups, the United States didn't say much because I think they saw that France was losing grip, and it's probably a power grab for them. So they're probably trying to see how it plays out.
Similar to like a Spanish-American War kind of thing.
Yeah, precisely. The imperialist powers don't have, like, there's no honor among thieves. So these people, at times these things break down. But to the anti-French sentiments, to that, what I mentioned earlier about the CFA franc, which is kind of like the currency, which literally has colonial in its name. It's been changed since, but its original name was the colonial franc. And that's where a lot of the anti-sentiments come from. The African masses recognize their conditions as a consequence of the colonialism. And the CFA franc was created in like 1945, and France has since, the consequence of it is there's no monetary sovereignty. France has a de facto veto on boards of the two central banks, which in the CFA franc zone. So, even ECOWAS, like how it's said is French, right? A lot of these countries speak French. So like there are the very, very prevalent Western, but French like control in very evident ways. That being said, in Burkina Faso in particular, during their takeover, there were burnings of American flags as well. So I think we'd be remiss and not fully accurate if we just said it's anti-French sentiments, which I think France has had the most presence there, so it's probably more prevalent. But I think there's generally a growing anti-imperialist broadly consciousness that's building in the Sahelian region, with especially amongst the AES. And I think that is due to the fact of the leaders and like who is like pushing forward that, but also the African masses can think for themselves. They can assess their economic and political situation and see that not controlling your currency is an act, is an act of colonialism. Not having political direction in your so-called institutions is, acts of colonialism. Not being able to have the control of your destiny and the direction of your country are these acts of colonialism. So the economic impact, I think, is broadly what raises consciousness. But since the Berlin Conference, since after war, the Second Imperialist War, these countries, the Western countries, have kind of partitioned the continent in many ways and have been barriers to industrialization. There have been political interference, as we mentioned, with the revolutionary coups like Burkina Faso, and France has been accused, and they've been accused of it, but like some of them have been like confirmed of removing leaders from office, right, in that area. So there's legitimate grievances with French governance, but also just a general anti-Western sentiment, because I think the African masses recognize that their conditions aren't happenstance, but a direct consequence of colonialism and neocolonialism.
Coming back to the original myth of, Africa's not, don't value or prioritize democracy, but it does appear, at least in, in certain enclaves, and probably, if you got past the leaders of a lot of these countries, you'll find it even more broadly. There is a Pan-Africanist, revolutionary Pan-Africanist sentiment or an enthusiasm that has happened behind some of these recent coups. At least that's what it looks like to me. But if you do see it as that as being a Pan-Africanist sentiment, why does there appear to be one? I think some of that's already been answered, just in the sense of like their actual material conditions and what they're dealing with. And without being like, like a hopeless romantic about it or super idealistic, like, do you think that there is real potential here? Like, just looking at it materially, do you think there's real potential for something to grow here? Again, we're talking about within this Western Sahelian region, primarily within Nigeria, Mali, Burkina Faso, and on a lesser note, even Guinea. I don't know if they're quite moving in the same direction, but I think some people have thrown them in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's accurate. I think that the massive anti-imperialist consciousness that Nick was speaking to, and that you mentioned, that sees Pan-Africanism as like a revolutionary objective, has been growing for years, right? For since before these coups, these most recent coups that we talked about even took place. People have been talking about imperialism and how the French and the West, the US, as Nick kind of spoke to, had been robbing and exploiting them for over 100 years, right? And so the elevated consciousness in the region has led to an understanding of imperialism, of French neocolonialism, of exploitation, the invasion of Libya even, and the CFA franc. And so that has also kind of led to an understanding of the need for Pan-Africanism, right, as an objective, right? And so that's kind of
just to kind of complicate this a little bit, if you don't mind. Like,
Yeah.
we talked earlier about China and Russia. How do you see Pan-Africanism being developed with those kind of relationships? In relation specifically to the region that we're talking about. Like, 'cause some people will say, well, you're just a stooge for Russia. It was the French, now it's Russia, now it's China. So how do you see that? I guess I'm just sorry if I'm to cut you off. I'm just thinking out loud. Maybe if we could complicate that a little bit more.
It's a good question. Yeah, and I would even add Iran to that, right? Because Iran, right? Recently we've heard about Niger wanting to kick the U.S. military out of their country, right? Um, and that came as a result of some talks that were happening between U.S. officials and Nigerian ones, and the U.S. Ones were kind of upset. They were upset. They disapproved of discussions that were taking place between Niger and Iran, right? Like there was a deal to sell Nigerian uranium to Iran, and obviously, the U.S. sees, Iran, China, Russia is, these boogeymen, right? That they're threatening, uh, uh, I guess Western hegemony or whatever. But what we say in BAB consistently is that there's really a scramble for Africa in the sense that there are, and Nick already kind of got into that, right? Like how there's like this competition between these various, states, these powers that, want access to these resources on the continent and, the land and labor as well. And so I think, that's an important component. And so, the fact that Niger saw that as an affront, right? Like they were upset that the US disapproved of their discussions with Iran, right? Speaks to, the importance they place on, the ability to make their own decisions, to choose who they want to trade with or partner with, right? And I think that speaks to, the importance of, yeah, independence of Pan-Africanism in the sense that, how are we able to control our own resources and provide for ourselves and make decisions on who we partner with. So I would say that, the Nigerian decision to kick the US military out of their country, because of, that whole piece around Iran, is one example of that. And, I might be able to touch on that a little bit more in a little bit. But yeah, I think, that is really what, the people, the movements on the ground are calling for, right? An independent, a sovereign United States of Africa in alignment with the vision of, the founding fathers, we could say, of Pan-Africanism, like Nkrumah, Ahmed Sekou Toure, Modibo Keita, Lumumba, and others, right? Like the creation of the alliance of Sahelian states, right? The Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso's kind of more military-oriented alliance is seen by many as like a step towards, you know, uh, uh, that project of the United States of Africa. And those were demands. Those are demands of the mass movement, right? And under previous governments, right? So like for example, in Burkina Faso, right, we talked about Blaise Compaoré, right? And that uh he was very much aligned with the West. And so because of that, many of those demands that are being adopted, they're being worked towards on the ground in the Western Sahel and in these three countries. The discussion of these demands was taboo, right? You couldn't publicly critique the CFA front, right?
So
Um,
one of the demands was to for this unification
Yeah,
that okay.
that's a
Yeah.
continual demand on the ground. That's what people are calling for. That they see the importance of unification because I think as Nkrumah and others have stated, right? Like we're stronger when we're united, and people are reading Nkrumah, people are reading and discussing these ideas, and so I think that's something that isn't coming through. That a lot of the policies they're being implemented by these governments, these governments of Traore and Chiani and Goita. Basically everything, almost everything they've worked towards came from the ground, right? Like they're in alignment with the masses, and that's why they're making a lot of these decisions, right? And so I think for 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 us as we could say Africans who aren't in the continent, Black African people, we should, I think, be uniting with these movements. We should be developing solidarity campaigns and working towards strengthening their work, because I think there's a real strong push and movement for more revolutionary ideals and work and programs, right, on the ground. in the Sahel. And so I think, that to get back to your question around, this I guess the competition between, the US and France and NATO versus, Russia's, China's, Iran and the others, right? The other enemies of the West or whatever. I think, this kind of falls within the broader uh um I guess geopolitical calculus, right? In terms of like how do we see uh um the ability of these states to seek out the best deals for that work for their own interests, right? Because a lot of times when you're partnering with the US and France or whatever, you're not getting great deals. You're oftentimes forced to accept um uh, uh I guess terms that aren't super beneficial. But the Chinas of the world are
Could
able to offer
you
alternative.
could you just for just thinking about people who may not follow if they made it this far, um, like what's the point of or what's the purpose of deals? Because I think there does become sometimes I think it's a very idealistic conception of things where it's like, well, if we're saying self-determination, we're not gonna deal. We don't need no Russians. We don't know Chinese people. We don't need no Americans. We need the West. We're gonna do it ourselves. Like why? So why do you need deals? Like why do you need to partner with and trade with another nation, regardless of who it is? How does that help you in your situation in your geopolitical context? How does that help you as a nation, as a people develop towards your goals?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think when I'm talking about deals, I'm talking about trade, right? And you know, uh, uh, different countries have different strengths, right? So one country might be more productive in producing a certain product, let's say uranium, right? Because uranium is, important to Niger, right? It is an important source of energy, right? Niger has massive uranium reserves, and France has been able to benefit from those for such a long time. And I think they're still kind of benefiting, right? Like there's more
That's
work
how
to
they
be
get a
done.
lot of electricity, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think
Yeah.
15 to 30% of French electricity is powered by Nigerian uranium. And a lot of the uranium that has gone to France has been used to power I guess French households, but also the Eiffel Tower, right? And that's we're talking about Niger, where so much of the population doesn't even have access to electricity, right? And so like I said, a lot of the deals, a lot of the trade that the African countries, the Western Sahelian countries are doing is not super beneficial to them. But in theoretically, right, trade is supposed to help in terms of benefiting from what folks call comparative advantage, and that's an idea that came from some economists called David Ricardo, and basically it's that you can uh, uh, I guess benefit from that trade because you export the products where you're better at, producing that. So, Niger would export uranium and maybe import, let's say from Burkina Faso, the gold that they have or something, right? Like, or, let's say that, uh, maybe Russia has a whole bunch of wheat or whatever. And, I guess Mali has, I don't know, some oil or something, right? Like because they're better at producing oil in Mali, and Russia's better at producing wheat. They're using less resources within their own countries to acquire that wheat. And Russia's able to acquire the oil. So I think it's more a question of like how productive can you be as a country, and trade makes you more productive. So there's an advantage to doing that. It's a more efficient use of your resources, and you're able to get everything that you need. And one actually important aspect of pan-Africanist thought, I guess you could say, is that within the African continent there's such an abundance of resources that if the continent were to unite in some sort of federation or something of African states, we would be able to supply each other with you know almost everything that we need, because there's so much available on the continent that is currently being siphoned off and exploited by outside forces. And so, yeah, I think, because of that, multipolarity that Nick was talking about, where, you don't have to just run, like, work with the West, work with the US, France, and those others, you're able to get better trade terms, trade partnerships, and, be much more productive, right? Because the current state of things is that, basically the Western Sahel is being robbed. Like most of the third world, most of the overexploited world is being robbed for and their resources are being siphoned and they're not getting a lot out of it. And so I think that this is very beneficial, and the fact that they're in competition. The West is in competition with Russia and China and Iran, and so there's different, like, I guess the third world, or these African states are able to get better terms for the things that they're good at producing. So I guess I think that's one advantage. But yeah, there's so much that a united African federation or whatever could help with, in terms of defense, right? Like that alliance of Sahelian states is ultimately a defense alliance, right? It's to fight off the paramilitaries, the terrorist groups that were essentially brought in, or empowered by neocolonialism, the invasion of Libya, and the influx of US and French weapons, right? And so because they're able to come together and share military tactics and resources and strategies, they're able to better fight off these terrorist groups, these paramilitaries that have been able to successfully take over so much of the countries in the Western Sahel. We spoke about Mali, where it was basically half of the country was taken over by those paramilitaries, and now that the AES is in place, they've been able to fight off these paramilitaries. So there's a lot of different ways that um, a united Africa could really improve the conditions of African people on the ground. And we didn't get to a lot of those ways, but I think that's what the people on the ground are seeing and understanding, and that's what they're fighting for. There are people still in the streets, marching and rallying and advocating for these demands, right? Whether it's kicking out this or ending that CFA franc arrangement, or kicking out the US from their countries, and I think so far they've been really effective militarily, and now the demands have shifted to more economic arrangements. Like, how can we make sure that we're getting better trade deals, we're not dominated in terms of like banking and currencies and those types of things. But yeah, I think the importance of the Pan-Africanist attitude, or consciousness, has really been elevated in the process of these shifts and these coups, and the mass movements that have resulted.
I appreciate that, because I think thanks for that breakdown, specifically on like how it helps benefit, because I think, especially over in the United States, this idea of unity has been clowned so much that it either sounds superficial. It's like, what are we unifying for? We don't get along. We have too many blah blah blah. But like, as you demonstrated, like how you trade and how you can import goods that can be useful for your people, how you can take advantage of the things that you have in your own nation, but you may not have the technology to develop. So part of why the uranium benefits France more than it does Mali is because that uranium, or excuse me, Nigeria as well, that uranium they can get it out of they can get it out of the ground, but how do you develop it to turn it into electrical grids, right? Like, how do you develop it? And you have to have resources to do that. You don't just pull shit out of the ground and it just morphs into something else. Like, we could all see that if we walked outside right now and you picked a rock out of the ground. Well, you're not going to just be able to grind that rock into something else. You can't turn it into a sharp weapon just because you picked up, like, you have to have some way to sharpen it, right? So if you don't have those things, you got to get them somewhere.
Exactly.
So like, this is what it is. And I always try to stress that with people, because they get caught up in this kind of abstract unity It's like, no, like people are not able to actually pursue things that we take for granted over here. Like we go to stores and there's a bunch of shit on the shelf, and we can go to Lowe's and go to Menards or whatever, and all this stuff is shipped in, and we can pick it up, and we can hire somebody to come build things, and all this infrastructure is just built for us. And we assume, like, in a way, sometimes that's almost like that's how it is everywhere, and it's like, nah. And that's because of a lot of this stuff is looted from these places, right? So it's just like, I think we don't necessarily think about it in that sense. Well, Pan-Africanism isn't just a bunch of red, black, and green colors and the cultural stuff, even though that is important, but to even and be able to enjoy that, I mean, you can enjoy it in any capacity, but to be able to enjoy that, I think at its height and in more progressive ways, you want to have those resources already readily developed and around you. And if this country is doing a better deal than the next deal, then like I said earlier, like as I was quoting someone else, like we don't pick the conditions in which we get to struggle. You know, like we have to deal with the situation on the ground and figure out how we can build that, dialectically towards wherever we want to go. Right? It's just not going to be a simple Africans drive. So it's always confusing when people get mad. You don't have to like these other countries that they do deals with, but often we're not the ones doing deals because over in the United States, we don't even think about sovereignty over here. So it's not a real question. So yeah, thanks for that. I don't know if there was any other things. I think again, I think that last answer was good just because it gave people a sense of like, okay, you do have these countries who are trying to develop, but liberal democracy doesn't just get dropped in. If how they want to develop it, if these are the popular will of the people, then that's how they choose to do it. But I don't know if there's any other closing thoughts you'd like to give. Again, thanks for coming through. Thanks for Nick, even though he couldn't close out with us, but thanks for coming through. Is there any other things you wanted to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think you basically covered it. Thanks for having us. But yeah, I think we have to, as if you consider yourself an anti-imperialist, and like you said, I think we have to, go with the will of the masses, right? And so I think, our position is, as bad, right? I guess I should say, is that we're with the people in their anti-imperialist sentiment, their Pan-Africanist sentiment. And so, I'm excited to see what develops, but then I would also say that as anti-imperialist and as Pan-Africanist, if you believe in that Pan-African objective, we should be seeing ourselves as active participants in a sense. So like, how can we support that work that is going on to further build and develop the mass movements that are I guess present in the Western Sahel. And so, we have to kind of contribute to that process to, make leaders want to support the masses. And yeah, I think, whether it is connecting with folks on the ground. I know there are groups like, the Thomas Sankara Center that are, engaged in political education in Burkina Faso, and there are others. There's all sorts of movements, and so I'm thinking like, how do we be active participants? That's my last point in these processes for you know yeah for more participatory democratic processes essentially. That's all I wanted to share.
Yeah, thanks for that. So again, I hope people were able to keep track with the myth again. We have to even when we don't get everything right, we have to give ourselves credit as thinking people. We're talking about black and African people, like we have to give ourselves credit as thinking people and not just throw these labels around that often don't lead to any kind of thinking. They're just zombie-like in a way. So when someone says Africans don't appreciate democracy, maybe they don't appreciate this very, liberal dictating democracy that doesn't allow them to actually flourish, but it implies that Africans don't appreciate any kind of civilization, any kind of care for, humanity. It's just barbarism effectively, right? So I think this conversation showed like it's not that simple. Like, there are real struggles. Some we win, some we don't. Just as you have this unification of the Western Sahelian states, you also have the nonsense going on, and as we'll talk about in Rwanda and Uganda, and the ways that they continue to foil any kind of progress in the DRC. Sudan. So, there's struggles all around that, we can get to it. So when people say, well, what about this or what about that? Well, okay, we can talk about it, but it's much more complicated and it deserves real investigation. So thanks for that. Thank you, Nick, and I'll see y'all back for the one on what about the Congo.
Sounds great. Appreciate you.
I appreciate it.
Okay, fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck.